I am so glad that you are here to listen to a story. I will be reading for you selected passages from the book The Coral Island, A Tale of the Pacific Ocean by R.M. Ballantyne. I wanted you to relax, forget about the day, and just listen to this story. It was a wild, black night of howling storm, the night in which I was born on the foaming bosom of a broad Atlantic Ocean. My father was a sea captain. My grandfather was a sea captain. My great-grandfather had been a Marine. Nobody could tell positively what occupation his father had followed, but my dear mother used to assert that he had been a midshipsman, whose grandfather, on the mother's side, had been an admiral in the Royal Navy. At any rate, we knew that as far back as our family could be traced, it had been intimately connected with the great watery waste. Indeed, this was the case on both sides of the house, for my mother always went to sea with my father on the long voyages, and so spent the greater part of her life upon the water. Thus it was, I suppose, that I came to inherit a roving disposition. Soon after I was born, my father, being old, retired from a seafaring life, purchased a small cottage in a fishing village on the west coast of England, and settled down to spend the evening of his life on the shores of that sea which had for so many years been his home. It was not long after this that I began to show the roving spirit that dwelt within me. For some time past my infant legs had been gaining strength, so that I came to be dissatisfied with rubbing the skin off my chubby knees by walking on them, and made many attempts to stand up and walk like a man. All of which attempts, however, resulted in my sitting down violently and in sudden surprise. One day I took advantage of my dear mother's absence to make another effort, and to my joy I actually succeeded in reaching the doorstep, over which I tumbled into a pool of muddy water that lay before my father's cottage door. Ah, how vividly I remember the horror of my poor mother when she found me sweltering in the mud amongst a group of cackling ducks, and the tenderness with which she stripped off my dripping clothes and washed my dirty little body. From this time forth, my rambles became more frequent, and as I grew older, more distant, until at last I had wandered far and near on the shore and in the woods around our humble dwelling, and did not rest content until my father bound me apprentice to a coasting vessel and let me go to sea. For some years I was happy in visiting the seaports and in coasting along the shores of my native land. My Christian name was Ralph, and my comrades added to this the name of Rover, in consequence of the passion that I always evinced for traveling. Rover was not my real name, but as I never received any other, I came at last to answer to it as naturally as to my proper name. And, as it is not a bad one, I see no good reason why I should not introduce myself to the reader as Ralph Rover. My shipmates were kind, good-natured fellows, and they and I got on very well together. They did indeed very frequently make game of and banter me, but not unkindly. And I overheard them sometimes saying that Ralph Rover was a queer old-fashioned fellow. This, I must confess, surprised me much, and I pondered the saying long, but could come at no satisfactory conclusion as to that wherein my old-fashionedness lay. It is true I was a quiet lad, and seldom spoke except when spoken to. Moreover, I never could understand the jokes of my companions, even when they were explained to me, which dullness in apprehension occasioned me much grief. However, I tried to make up for it by smiling and looking pleased when I observed that they were laughing at some witticism which I had failed to detect. I was also very fond of inquiring into the nature of things and their causes, and often fell into fits of abstraction while thus engaged in my mind. But in all this I saw nothing that did not seem to be exceedingly natural, and could by no means understand why my comrades should call me an old-fashioned fellow. Now, while engaged in the coasting trade, I fell in with many seamen who had traveled to almost every quarter of the globe, and I freely confess that my heart glowed ardently within me as they recounted the wild adventures in foreign lands, the dreadful storms they had weathered, the appalling dangers they had escaped, the wonderful creatures they had seen both on the land and in the sea, and the interesting lands and strange people they had visited. But of all the places of which they told me, none captivated and charmed my imagination so much as the coral island of the southern seas. They told me of thousands of beautiful, fertile islands that had been formed by a small creature called the coral insect, where summer reigned nearly all year round, where the trees were laden with a constant harvest of luxuriant fruit, where the climate was almost perpetually delightful. These exciting accounts had so great an effect upon my mind that when I reached the age of 15, I resolved to make a voyage to the South Seas. I had no little difficulty at first in prevailing on my dear parents to let me go, but when I urged on my father that he would never have become a great captain had he remained in the coasting trade, he saw the truth of what I said and gave his consent. My dear mother, seeing that my father had made up his mind, no longer offered opposition to my wishes. "But, oh, Ralph," she said, on the day I bade her adieu, "come back soon to us, my dear boy, for we are getting old now, Ralph, and may not have many years to live." I will not take up my reader's time with a minute account of all that occurred before I took my final leave of my dear parents. Suffice it to say that my father placed me under the charge of an old messmate of his own, a merchant captain who was on the point of sailing to the South Seas in his own ship, the Arrow. Soon afterwards, I went on board the Arrow, which was a fine, large ship, and set sail for the islands of the Pacific Ocean. It was a bright, beautiful, warm day when our ship spread her canvases to the breeze and sailed for the regions of the south. Oh, how my heart bounded with delight as I listened to the merry chorus of the sailors, while they hauled at the ropes and got in the anchor. The captain shouted, the man ran to obey, the noble ship bent over to the breeze, and the shore gradually faded from my view, while I stood looking on with a kind of feeling that the whole was a delightful dream. The first thing that struck me as being different from anything I had yet seen during my short career on the sea was the hoisting of the anchor on deck and lashing it firmly down with ropes, as if we had now bid adieu to the land forever and would require its services no more. There, lass, take a good nap now, for we shan't ask you to kiss the mud again for many a long day to come. And so it was that anchor did not kiss the mud for many long days afterwards, and when at last it did, it was for the last time. There was a number of boys in the ship, but two of them were my special favorites. Jack Martin was a tall, strapping, broad-shouldered youth of 18, with a handsome, good-humored, firm face. He had had a good education, was clever and hearty, and lion-like in his actions, but mild and quiet in disposition. Jack was a general favorite and had a peculiar fondness for me. My other companion was Peterkin Gay. He was little, quick, funny, decidedly mischievous, and about 14 years old. But Peterkin's mischief was almost always harmless, else he could not have been so much beloved as he was. "Hallo, youngster," cried Jack Martin, giving me a slap on the shoulder the day I joined the ship. "Come below, and I'll show you your berth. You and I are to be messmates, and I think we shall be good friends, for I like the look of you." Jack was right. He and I and Peterkin afterwards became the best and stanchest friends that ever tossed together on the stormy waves. I shall say little about the first part of our voyage. We had the usual amount of rough weather and calm. Also, we saw many strange fish rolling in the sea, and I was greatly delighted one day by seeing a shoal of flying fish dart out of the water and skim through the air about a foot above the surface. They were pursued by dolphins, which feed on them, and one flying fish, in its terror, flew over the ship, struck on the rigging, and fell upon the deck. Its wings were just fins elongated, and we found that they could never fly far at a time, and never mounted into the air like birds, but skimmed along the surface of the sea. Jack and I had it for dinner, and found it remarkably good. When we approached Cape Horn, at the southern extremity of America, the weather became very cold and stormy, and the sailors began to tell stories about the furious gales and the dangers of that terrible cape. "Cape Horn," said one, "is the most horrible headland I ever doubled. I've sailed around it twice already, and both times the ship was almost blown out of the water." "And I've been around it once," said another, "and that time the sails were split and the ropes frozen in the blocks so that they wouldn't work, and we was all but lost." "And I've been around it 5 times," cried a third, "and every time was that another. The gales was so tremendous." "And I've been around it no times at all," cried Perkin, with an impudent wink of his eye, "and that time I was blowed inside out." Nevertheless, we passed the dreaded cape without much rough water, and, in the course of a few weeks afterwards, were sailing gently before a warm tropical breeze over the Pacific Ocean. Thus we proceeded on our voyage, sometimes bounding merrily before a fair breeze, at other times floating calmly on a glassy wave and fishing for the curious inhabitants of the deep. All of which, although the sailors thought little of them, were strange and interesting and very wonderful to me. At last we came among the coral islands of the Pacific, and I shall never forget the delight with which I gazed when we chanced to pass one at the pure white dazzling shores and the verdant palm trees, which looked bright and beautiful in the sunshine. And often did we three long to be landed on one, imagining that we should certainly find perfect happiness there. Our wish was granted sooner than we expected. One night, soon after we entered the tropics, an awful storm burst upon our ship. The first squall of wind carried away 2 of our masts and left only the foremast standing. Even this, however, was more than enough, for we did not dare to hoist a rag of sail on it. For 5 days the tempest raged in all of its fury. Everything was swept off the decks except one small boat. The steersman was lashed to the wheel, lest he should be washed away, and we all gave ourselves up for lost. The captain said that he had no idea where we were, as we had been blown far out of our course, and we feared much that we might get among the dangerous coral reefs which are so numerous in the Pacific. At daybreak on the 6th morning of the gale, we saw land ahead. It was an island encircled by a reef of coral, on which the waves broke in fury. There was calm water within this reef, but we could only see one narrow opening into it. For this opening was steered, but ere we reached it, a tremendous wave broke on our stern, tore the rudder completely off, and left us at the mercy of the winds and waves. "It's all over with us now, lads," said the captain to the men. "Get the boat ready to launch. We shall be on the rocks in less than half an hour." The men obeyed in gloomy silence, for they felt that there was little hope of so small a boat living in such a sea. "Come, boys," said Jack Martin in a grave tone to me and Peterkin, as we stood on the quarterdeck awaiting our fate. "Come, boys, we 3 shall stick together. You see, it is impossible that the little boat can reach the shore, crowded with men. It will be sure to upset, so I mean rather to trust myself to a large oar. I see through the telescope that the ship will strike at the tail of the reef, where the waves break into the quiet water inside. So if we manage to cling to the oar till it is driven over the breakers, we may perhaps gain the shore. What say you? Will you join me?" We gladly agreed to follow Jack, for he inspired us with confidence, although I could perceive by the sad tone in his voice that he had little hope. And indeed, when I looked at the white waves that lashed the reef and boiled against the rocks as if in fury, I felt that there was but a step between us and death. My heart sank within me. The ship was now very near the rocks. The men were ready with the boat, and the captain beside them giving orders, when a tremendous wave came towards us. We 3 ran towards the bow to lay hold of our oar, and had barely reached it when the wave fell on the deck with a crash like thunder. At the same moment the ship struck. The foremast broke off close to the deck and went over the side, carrying the boat and men along with it. Our oar got entangled with the wreck, and Jack seized an axe to cut it free, but owing to the motion of the ship, he missed the cordage and struck the axe deep into the oar. Another wave, however, washed it clear of the wreck. We all seized hold of it, and the next instant we were struggling in the wild sea. The last thing I saw was the boat whirling in the surf, and all of the sailors tossed into the foaming waves. Then I became insensible. On recovering from my swoon, I found myself lying on a bank of soft grass, under the shelter of the overhanging rock, with Peterkin on his knees by my side, tenderly bathing my temples with water, and endeavoring to stop the blood that flowed from a wound in my forehead. There is a strange and peculiar sensation experienced in recovering from a state of insensibility, which is almost indescribable. A sort of dreamy, confused consciousness, a half-waking, half-sleeping condition accompanied with a feeling of weariness, which, however, is by no means disagreeable. As I slowly recovered and heard the voice of Peterkin inquiring whether I felt better, I thought that I must have overslept myself and should be sent to the masthead for being lazy. But before I could leap up in haste, the thought seemed to vanish suddenly away, and I fancied that I must have been ill. Then a balmy breeze fanned my cheek, and I thought of home, and the garden at the back of my father's cottage, with its luxuriant flowers, and the sweet-scented honeysuckle that my dear mother trained so carefully upon the trellised porch. But the roaring of the surf put these delightful thoughts to flight, and I was back again at sea, watching the dolphins and the flying fish, and reefing topsails off the wind and stormy Cape Horn. Gradually, the roar of the surf became louder and more distinct. I thought of being wrecked far, far away from my native land, and slowly opened my eyes to meet those of my companion Jack, who, with a look of intense anxiety, was gazing into my face. "Speak to us, my dear Rolf," whispered Jack tenderly. "Are you better now?" I smiled and looked up, saying, "Better? Why, what do you mean, Jack? I'm quite well." "Then what are you shamming for and frightening us in this way?" said Peterkin, smiling through his tears, for the poor boy had been really under the impression that I was dying. I now raised myself on my elbow, and putting my hand to my forehead, found that it had been cut pretty severely, and that I had lost a good deal of blood. Come, Ralph," said Jack, pressing me gently backwards. "Lie down, my boy. You're not right yet. Wet your lips with this water. It's cool and clear as crystal. I got it from a spring close at hand. There now, don't say a word. Hold your tongue," said he. Seeing me about to speak, "I'll tell you all about it, but you must not utter a syllable till you have rested well." "Oh, don't stop him from speaking, Jack," said Peterkin, who, now that his fears for my safety were removed, busied himself in erecting a shelter of broken branches, in order to protect me from the wind, which, however, was almost unnecessary, for the rock beside which I had been laid completely broke the force of the gale. "Let him speak, Jack. It's a comfort to hear that he's alive, after lying there stiff and white and sulky for a whole hour, just like an Egyptian mummy. Never saw such a fellow as you are, Ralph, always up to mischief, You've almost knocked out all my teeth and more than half choked me, and now you go shamming dead. It's very wicked of you, indeed it is." While Peterkin ran on in this style, my faculties became quite clear again, and I began to understand my position. "What do you mean by saying I half choked you, Peterkin?" said I. "What do I mean? Is English not your mother tongue, or do you want me to repeat it in French, by way of making it clearer? Don't you remember?" "I remember nothing," said I, interrupting him after we were thrown into the sea. "Hush, Peterkin," said Jack. "You're exciting Ralph with your nonsense. I'll explain it to you. You recollect that after the ship struck, we three sprang over the bow into the sea. Well, I noticed that the oar struck your head and gave you that cut on the brow, which nearly stunned you, so that you grasped Peterkin around the neck without knowing apparently what you were about. In doing so, you pushed the telescope, which you clung to as if it had been your life, against Peterkin's mouth." "Pushed it against his mouth," interrupted Peterkin. "Say, crammed it down his throat. Why, there's a distinct mark of the brass rim on the back of my gullet at this moment." "Well, well, be that as it may," continued Jack, "you clung to him, Ralph, till I feared you really would choke him. But I saw that he had a good hold of the oar, so I exerted myself to the utmost to push you towards the shore, which we luckily reached without much trouble, for the water inside the reef is quite calm." "But the captain and crew, what of them?" I inquired anxiously. Jack shook his head. "Are they lost?" "No, they're not lost, I hope, but I fear there's not much chance of their being saved. The ship struck at the very tail of the island on which we are cast. When the boat was tossed into the sea, it fortunately did not upset, although it shipped a good deal of water, and all the men managed to scramble into it. But before they could get to the oars, out the gale carried them past the point and away to leeward of the island. After we landed, I saw them endeavoring to pull towards us, but as they had only one pair of oars out of the 8 that belonged to the boat, and as the wind was blowing right in their teeth, they gradually lost ground. Then I saw them put about and hoist some sort of sail, a blanket, I fancy, for it was too small for the boat, and in half an hour they were out of sight. "Poor fellows," I murmured sorrowfully. "But the more I think about it, I have better hope of them," continued Jack in a more cheerful tone. "You see, Ralph, I've read a great deal about these South Sea islands, and I know that in many places they are scattered about in thousands over the sea, so they're almost sure to fall in with one of them before long." "I'm sure I hope so," said Peterkin earnestly. "But what has become of the wreck, Jack? I saw you clambering up the rocks while I was watching Ralph. Did you say she had gone to pieces?" "No, she has not gone to pieces, but she has gone to the bottom," replied Jack. "As I said before, she struck on the tail of the island and stove in her bow, but the next breaker swung her clear and she floated away to leeward. The poor fellows in the boat made a hard struggle to reach her, but long before they came near her, she filled and went down. It was after she foundered that I saw them trying to pull to the island." There was a long silence after Jack ceased speaking, and I have no doubt that each one was revolving in his mind our extraordinary position. For many part, I can say that my reflections were very agreeable. I knew that we were on an island, for Jack had said so, but whether it was inhabited or not, I did not know. Oh, thought I, if the ship had only struck on the rocks, we might have done pretty well, for we could have obtained provisions from her and tools to enable us to build a shelter. But now, alas, alas, we are lost. These last words I uttered aloud in my distress. Lost, Ralph, exclaimed Jack, while a smile overspread his hardy countenance. Saved, you should have said. Your cogitations seem to have taken a wrong road and led you to a wrong conclusion. Do you know what conclusion I have come to? Said Peterkin. I have made up my mind that it's capital, first rate, the best thing that ever happened to us, and the most splendid prospect that ever lay before three jolly young tars. We've got an island all to ourselves. We now seated ourselves upon a rock and began to examine into our personal property. When we reached the shore, after being wrecked, my companions had taken off part of their clothes and spread them out in the sun to dry. For, although the gale was raging fiercely, there was not a single cloud in the bright sky. They had also stripped off most part of my wet clothes and spread them also on the rocks. Having resumed our garments, we now searched all of our pockets with the utmost care and laid their contents out on the flat stone before us. And now that our minds were fully alive to our condition, it was with no little anxiety that we turned our several pockets inside out, in order that nothing might escape us. When all was collected together, we found that our worldly goods consisted of the following articles. First, a small penknife with a single blade broken off about the middle and very rusty, besides having 2 or 3 notches on its edge. Peterkin said of this, with his usual pleasantry, that it would do for a saw as well as a knife, which was a great advantage. Second, an old German silver pencil case without any lead in it. Third, a piece of whipcord about 6 yards long. Fourth, a sailmaker's needle of a small size. Fifth, a ship's telescope, which I happened to have in my hand at the time the ship struck, and which I had clung to firmly all the time I was in the water. Indeed, it was with difficulty that Jack got it out of my grasp when I was lying insensible on the shore. I cannot understand why I kept such a firm hold of this telescope. They say that a drowning man will clutch at a straw. Perhaps it may have been some such feeling in me, for I did not know that it was in my hand at the time we were wrecked. However, we felt some pleasure in having it with us now, although we did not see that it could be of much use to us, as the glass at the small end was broken to pieces. Our 6th article was a brass ring, which Jack always wore on his little finger. I never understood why he wore it, for Jack was not vain of his appearance and did not seem to care for ornaments of any kind. Peterkin said it was in memory of the girl he left behind him, but he never spoke of this girl to either of us. I am inclined to think that Peterkin was either jesting or mistaken. In addition to these articles, we had a little bit of tinder and the clothes on our backs. The last were as follows. Each of us had on a pair of stout canvas trousers and a pair of sailor's thick shoes. Jack wore a red flannel shirt, a blue jacket, and a red Kilmarnock bonnet or nightcap, besides a pair of worsted socks and a cotton pocket handkerchief with 16 portraits of Lord Nelson printed on it, and a Union Jack in the middle. Peterkin had on a striped flannel shirt, which he wore outside his trousers, and belted around his waist after the manner of a tunic, and a round black straw hat. He had no jacket, having thrown it off just before we were cast into the sea, but this was not of much consequence, as the climate of the island proved to be extremely mild, so much so indeed that Jack and I often preferred to go about without our jackets. Peterkin had also a pair of white cotton socks and a blue handkerchief with white spots all over it. My own costume consisted of a blue flannel shirt, a blue jacket, a black cap, and a pair of worsted socks, beside the shoes and canvas trousers already mentioned. This was all we had, and besides these things we had nothing else. But when we thought of the danger from which we had escaped, and how much worse off we might have been had the ship struck on the reef during the night, we felt very thankful that we were possessed of so much, although I must confess we sometimes wished that we had had a little more. While we were examining these things and talking about them, Jack suddenly started and exclaimed, "The oar! We have forgotten the oar." "What good will that do us?" said Peterkin. "There's wood enough on the island to make 1,000 oars." "Aye, lad," replied Jack, "but there's a bit of hoop iron at the end of it, and that may be of much use to us." "Very true," I said. "Let us go fetch it." And with that, we all three rose and hastened down to the beach. I still felt a little weak from the loss of blood, so that my companions soon began to leave me behind. But Jack perceived this, and, with his usual considerate good nature, turned back to help me. This was now the first time that I had looked well about me since landing, as the spot where I had been laid was covered with thick bushes, which almost hid the country from our view. As we now emerged from among these and walked down the sandy beach together, I cast my eyes about, and truly my heart glowed within me and my spirit rose at the beautiful prospect which I beheld on every side. The gale had suddenly died away, just as if it had blown furiously till dashed our ship upon the rocks, and had nothing more to do after accomplishing that. The island on which we stood was hilly, and covered almost everywhere with the most beautiful and richly colored trees, bushes, and shrubs, none of which I knew the names of at that time, except indeed the coconut palms, which I recognized at once from the many pictures that I had seen of them before I had left home. A sandy beach of dazzling whiteness lined this bright green shore, and upon it there fell a gentle ripple of the sea. This last astonished me much, for I recollected that at home the sea used to fall in huge billows on the shore long after the storm had subsided. But on casting my glance out to sea, the cause became apparent. About a mile distant from the shore I saw the great billows of the ocean rolling like a green wall, and falling with a long, loud roar upon a low coral reef, where they were dashed into white foam and flung up in clouds of spray. This spray sometimes flew exceedingly high, and every here and there a beautiful rainbow was formed for a moment among the falling drops. We afterwards found that this coral reef extended quiet around the island and formed a natural breakwater to it, Beyond this, the sea rose and tossed violently from the effects of the storm, but between the reef and the shore it was as calm and smooth as a pond. My heart was filled with more delight than I can express at sight of so many glorious objects. On coming up, we found that Peterkin was vainly endeavoring to pull the axe out of the oar, into which, it will be remembered, Jack struck it a while endeavoring to cut away the cordage at which it had become entangled at the bow of the ship. Fortunately for us, the axe had remained fast in the oar, and even now all of Peterkin's strength could not draw it out of the cut. "Ah, this is capital indeed," cried Jack, at the same time giving the axe a wrench that plucked it out of the tough wood. "How fortunate this is! It will be of more value to us than 100 knives, and the edge is quite new and sharp." "I'll answer for the toughness of the handle, at any rate," cried Peterkin. "My arms are nearly plugged out of the sockets. But see here, our luck is great. There's iron on the blade." He pointed to a piece of hoop iron as he spoke, which had been nailed round the blade of the oar to prevent it from splitting. This also was a fortunate discovery. Jack went down on his knees, and with the edge of the axe began carefully to force out the nails. But as they were firmly fixed in, and the operation blunted our axe, we carried the oar up with us to the place where we had left the rest of our things, intending to burn the wood away from the iron at a more convenient time. "Now, lads," said Jack, after we had laid it on the stone which contained our little awl, "I propose that we should go to the tail of the island, where the ship struck, which is only a quarter of a mile off, and see if anything else has been thrown ashore. I don't expect anything, but it is well to see. When we get back here, it will be time to have our supper and prepare our beds." "Agreed," cried Peterkin and I together, as indeed we would have agreed to any proposal that Jack made, for besides his being older and much stronger and taller than either of us, he was a very clever fellow, and I think would have induced people much older than himself to choose him for their leader, especially if they required to be led on a bold enterprise. Now, as we hastened along the white beach, which shone so brightly in the rays of the setting sun that our eyes were quite dazzled by its glare, it suddenly came into Peterkin's head that we had nothing to eat except the wild berries which grew in profusion at our feet. "What shall we do, Jack?" said he, with a rueful look. "Perhaps they may be poisonous." "No fear," replied Jack confidently. "I have observed that a few of them are not unlike some of the berries that grow wild on our own native hills. Besides, I saw 1 or 2 strange birds eating them just a few minutes ago, and what won't kill the birds won't kill us. But look up there, Peterkin," continued Jack, pointing to the branched head of a coconut palm. "There are nuts for us in all stages." "So there are," cried Peterkin, who, being of a very unobservant nature, had been too much taken up with other things to notice anything so high above his head as the fruit of a palm tree. But whatever faults my young comrade had, He could not be blamed for want of activity or animal spirits. Indeed, the nuts had scarcely been pointed out to him when he bounded up the tall stem of the tree like a squirrel, and in a few minutes returned with 3 nuts, each as large as a man's fist. "You had better keep them till we return," said Jack. "Let us finish our work before eating." "So be it, Captain. Go ahead," cried Peterkin, thrusting the nuts into his trouser pockets. "In fact, I don't want to eat just now, but I would give a good deal for a drink. Oh, that I could find a spring, but I don't see the smallest sign of one hereabouts. I say, Jack, how does it happen that you seem to be up to everything? You have told us the names of 6 trees already, and yet you say that you were never in the South Seas before." "I'm not up to everything, Peterkin, as you'll find out ere long," replied Jack with a smile. "But I have been a great reader of books of travel and adventure of all my life, and that has put me up to a good many things that you are, perhaps, not acquainted with." "Oh, Jack, that's all humbug. If you begin to lay everything to the credit of books, I'll quite lose my opinion of you," cried Peterkin, with a look of contempt. "I've seen a lot of old fellows that were always poring over books, and when they came to try to do anything, they were no better than baboons." "You are quite right," retorted Jack, "and I have seen a lot of fellows who never looked into books at all, who knew nothing about anything except the things they had actually seen, and very little they knew even about these. Indeed, some were so ignorant that they did not know that coconuts grew on coconut trees." I could not refrain from laughing at this rebuke, for there was much truth in it as to Peterkin's ignorance. "Humph, maybe you're right," answered Peterkin, "but I would not give 2pence for a man of books if he had nothing else in him." "Neither would I," said Jack, "but that's no reason why you should run books down, or think less of me for having read them. Suppose now, Peterkin, that you want to build a ship, and I were to give you a long and particular account of the way to do it. Would not that be very useful?" "No doubt of it," said Peterkin, laughing. "And suppose I were to write the account in a letter instead of telling you in words, would that be less useful?" "Well, no, perhaps not." "Well, I suppose I were to print it and send it to you in the form of a book. Would it not be as good and useful as ever?" "Oh, brother, Jack, you're a philosopher, and that's worse than anything," cried Peterkin, with a look of pretended horror. "Very well, Peterkin, we shall see," returned Jack, halting under the shade of a coconut tree. "You said you were thirsty just a minute ago. Now jump up that tree and bring down a nut. Not a ripe one, bring a green, unripe one." Peterkin looked surprised, but seeing that Jack was in earnest, he obeyed. "Now cut a hole in it with your penknife, and clap it to your mouth, old fella," said Jack. Peterkin did as he was directed, and we both burst into uncontrollable laughter at the changes that instantly passed over his expressive countenance. No sooner had he put the nut to his mouth and thrown back his head in order to catch what came out of it, that his eyes opened to twice their ordinary size with astonishment, while his throat moved vigorously in the act of swallowing. Then a smile and look of intense delight overspread his face, except indeed the mouth, which being firmly fixed to the hole in the nut, could not take part in the expression. But he endeavored to make up for this by winking at us excessively with his right eye. At length he stopped, and drawing a long breath exclaimed, "Nectar, perfect nectar. I say, Jack, you're a Briton. The best fellow I've ever met in my life. Only taste that," said he, turning to me and holding the nut to my mouth. I immediately drank, and certainly I was much surprised at the delightful liquid that flowed copiously down my throat. It was extremely cool and had a sweet taste, mingled with acid. In fact, it was the likest thing to lemonade I've ever tasted, and was most grateful and refreshing. I handed the nut to Jack, who, after tasting it, said, "Now, Peterkin, you unbeliever, I never saw or tasted a coconut in my life before, except those sold in shops at home. But I once read that the green nuts contain that stuff, and you see, it is true." "And pray," asked Peterkin, "what sort of stuff does the ripe nut contain?" "A hollow kernel," answered Jack, "with a liquid like milk in it, but it does not satisfy thirst so well as hunger. It is very wholesome food, I believe." "Meat and drink on the same tree," cried Peterkin. "Washing in the sea, lodging on the ground, and all for nothing. My dear boys, we are set up for life. It must be the ancient paradise. Hurrah!" And Peterkin tossed his straw hat in the air and ran along the beach, hallooing like a madman with delight. We afterwards found, however, that these lovely islands were very unlike paradise in many things, but more of this in its proper place. We had now come to the point of rocks on which the ship had struck, but did not find a single article, although we searched carefully among the coral rocks, which at this place jutted out so far as nearly to join the reef that encircled the island. Just as we were about to return, however, we saw something black floating on a little cove that had escaped our observation. Running forward, we drew it from the water and found it to be a long, thick leather boot, such as fishermen at home wear. And a few paces farther on, we picked up its fellow. We at once recognized these as having belonged to our captain, for he had worn them during the whole of the storm, in order to guard his legs from the waves and spray that constantly washed over our decks. My first thought on seeing them was that our dear captain had been drowned, but Jack soon put my mind more at rest on that point by saying that if the captain had been drowned with the boots on, he would certainly have been washed ashore along with them, and that he had no doubt whatever he had kicked them off while in the sea, that he might swim more easily. Peterkin immediately put them on, but they were so large that, as Jack said, they would have done for boots, trousers, and the vest too. I also tried them, but although I was long enough in the legs for them, They were much too large in their feet for me, so we handed them to Jack, who was anxious to make me keep them. But as they fitted his large limbs and feet as if they had been made for him, I would not hear of it, so he consented at last to use them. I may remark, however, that Jack did not use them often, as they were extremely heavy. It was beginning to grow dark when we returned to our encampment, so we put off our visit to the top of the hill till next day, and employed the light that yet remained to us in cutting down a quantity of boughs and the broad leaves of a tree, of which none of us knew the name. With these we erected a sort of rustic bower, in which we meant to pass the night. There was no absolute necessity for this, because the air of our island was so genial and balmy that we could have slept quite well without any shelter. But we were so little used to sleeping in the open air that we did not quite relish the idea of lying down without any covering over us. Besides, our bower would shelter us from the night dews of rain, if any should happen to fall. Having strewed the floor with leaves and dry grass, we bethought ourselves of supper. But it now occurred to us, for the first time, that we had no means of making a fire. "Now, there's a fix. What shall we do?" said Peterkin, while we both turned our eyes to Jack, to whom we always looked in our difficulties. Jack seemed not a little perplexed. "There are flints enough, no doubt, on the beach," said he, "but they are of no use at all without the steel. However, we must try." So saying, he went to the beach and soon returned with 2 flints. On one of them he placed the tinder and endeavored to ignite it, but it was with great difficulty that a very small spark was struck out of the flints, and the tinder, being a bad, hard piece, would not catch. He then tried the bit of hoop iron, which would not strike fire at all, and after that the back of the axe, with no better success. During all these trials, Peterkin sat with his hands in his pockets, gazing with a most melancholy visage at our comrade, his face growing longer and more miserable at each successive failure. "Oh dear," he sighed, "I would not care a button for the cooking of our victuals. Perhaps they don't need it, but it's so dismal to eat one's supper in the dark, and we have had such a capital day, that it's a pity to finish off in this glum style. Oh, I have it," he cried, starting up. "The spyglass. The big glass at the end is a burning glass." "You forget that we have no sun," said I. Peterkin was silent. In his sudden recollection of the telescope, he had quite overlooked the absence of the sun. "Ah, boys, I've got it now," exclaimed Jack, rising and cutting a branch from a neighboring bush, which he stripped of its leaves. "I recollect seeing this done once at home. Hand me the bit of whipcord." With the cord and branch, Jack soon formed a bow. Then he cut a piece about 3 inches long of the end of a dead branch, which he pointed at the 2 ends. Round this he passed the cord of the bow and placed one end against his chest, which was protected from its point by a chip of wood. The other point he placed against the bit of tinder, and then began to saw vigorously with the bow, just as a blacksmith does with his drill while boring a hole in a piece of iron. In a few seconds the tinder began to smoke. In less than a minute it caught fire, and in less than a quarter of an hour we were drinking our lemonade and eating coconuts round a fire that would have roasted an entire sheep, while the smoke, flames, and sparks flew up among the broad leaves of the overhanging palm trees and cast a warm glow upon our leafy bower. That night the starry sky looked down through the gentle rustling trees upon our slumbers, and the distant roaring of the surf upon the coral reef was our lullaby.